The 78th UN General Assembly opens in New York with a warning on day one.
Our world is becoming unhinged.
But with the leaders of 4 members of the UN Security Council skipping the week-long event, what does that say about the relevance and the future of the United Nations? Also, we'll look at that question we seem to ask every year. Is a permanent seat for Africa on the UN Security Council still in the cards? Straight Talk Africa starts now. Hello there and welcome to Straight Talk Africa, coming to you from VOA's headquarters in Washington. I'm Haydee Adams. Thank you so much for joining us. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres opened the 78th UN General Assembly with a somber assessment of the state of the world today.
Our world is becoming unhinged. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Global challenges are mounting. And we seem incapable of coming together to respond. The global humanitarian system is on the verge of collapse. Needs are rising and funding is drying up. Our humanitarian operations are being forced to make massive cuts. But if we don't feed the hungry, we are feeding conflict. And I urge all countries to step up and to fund fully our global humanitarian appeal.
Now, amid worries that the Sustainable Development Goals are not on track, world leaders at the UN General Assembly adopted a political declaration that could bring hope to so-called developing countries. Veronica Balderas Iglesias brings us the details from the UN.
On a rainy day in New York City, a somber reminder at the United Nations General Assembly of how world leaders are behind schedule in meeting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals they adopted in 2015 and hoped to achieve by 2030.
Despite commitments to eradicate poverty and to reduce hunger being at the core of this agenda, alarmingly, 1.2 billion people were still living in multidimensional poverty as of 2022. It is estimated that approximately 8% of global population, or 680 million people, will still be facing hunger in 2030.
Young leaders also raised concerns about the lack of progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, demanding action to combat climate change and concrete solutions to empower their generation.
68 million young people are looking for jobs. All over the world, millions of young people are unable to access social protection coverage. Mental health problems like depression and anxiety are a serious concern for young people.
World leaders did manage to adopt on Monday a political declaration that brings a ray of hope to struggling economies.
This includes clear support for an SDG stimulus of at least $500 billion a year, as well as an effective debt relief mechanism that supports payment suspensions, longer lending terms, and lower rates.
Guterres said countries can help get the SDGs back on track by paying attention to 6 targeted areas, including relieving hunger, ensuring gender equality, and improving education.
Our proposed Global Digital Compact will also help countries build safe digital systems that provide internet access for all, including students in hard-to-reach communities.
Guterres highlighted another initiative that aims to create 400 million new jobs, especially in the green, care, and digital sectors. He also emphasized that countries must act now to rescue the SDGs.
Well, we go now to VOA correspondent Veronica Balderas Iglesias, who is at the United Nations in New York for us. Veronica, great to see you. Give us a sense of the mood in New York among world leaders, given what the UN Secretary General warned about.
Yes, Haiti, well, yesterday we heard again from the Secretary General these very strong statements trying to put or shed light on the food insecurity, the hunger that developing nations are experiencing, and also really giving us a sense of lack of collaboration, lack of support from the advanced countries to the developing ones, despite this political declaration that they adopted the previous day, and that is going to bring this $500 billion a year to try to, make these projects become better in terms of sustainability and equality. However, we have to say that the President of the General Assembly did yesterday emphasize that change can be made, that it's just a matter of putting aside the divisions, putting aside all the conflicts that exist in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of lack of funding, and it is a way, it's a possible way of helping developing nations, but the will needs to be there. It cannot just be talks at this high level and then go back to their countries and not help the vulnerable nations, Haiti.
Well, yeah, it always comes down to money and political will, doesn't it? Veronica, what else is expected to come out of this gathering in coming days? We've already heard so many issues come up already, but what else can we expect?
Well, today, for example, we have the Security Council meetings. We also have a Climate Ambition Summit. So two of the most important things, I think, for the African continent will be the impact of the suspension by Russia of the Sea Grain Initiative, which is preventing the flow of grains from Ukraine that African countries really rely on. And so that's going to be one topic, but also the effects of climate change. We heard from analysts from the Center for Strategic International Studies. They replied to some questions. I asked them about the impact of climate change and how they say that the climate change is impacting the nations that are polluting the least, the ones that are contributing to greenhouse emissions the least. And so there needs to be money to build a better infrastructure that allows for adaptation and resilience. And that needs, again, money, it needs political will, it needs the involvement of governments, NGOs, and the citizens. But that's not going to happen immediately. And so these high-level officials from the United Nations are calling on world leaders to come together to try to engage. This is a very good opportunity, Haiti, to meet face-to-face, to build those relationships and then translate them into projects that are going to help developing nations.
Indeed. Veronica, just briefly, the leaders of France, the UK, China and Russia are skipping the event, of course, due to various reasons. But what are we to read into the fact that they are not there?
Well, we have to try to understand that the reasons that they gave, some of them, for instance, France and the UK, they mentioned scheduling conflicts, but we need to understand that China and Russia usually skip these high-level meetings at the General Assembly. And now there is also an international criminal court warrant for the arrest of President Vladimir Putin. So that makes it a little bit more difficult for him to travel if, the U.S. would actually issue him a visa. So this is giving the opportunity to the United States to engage with those developing nations that, in a way, have become very cozy with Russia and China. And so this is an opportunity for the U.S. to say, hey, I also have the resources, I have the political will, let's engage and let's steer away from those other relationships. So we can read that, I guess, into what is happening.
Well, yeah, not getting a visa would be the least of President Vladimir Putin's problems. Veronica Balderas Iglesias at the United Nations for us, a big thank you to you. Well, we're going to take a short break here, still ahead on Straight Talk Africa. The leaders of France, Russia, China and the UK all no-shows at this year's UNGA. What does that say about the UN's future and relevance? And is Africa's push for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council gaining or losing momentum? We'll talk about that when we come back.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain, and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
You're watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week right here on Red Carpet. We bring you the latest in
For most women, work has always been in confined spaces such as factories or office buildings. But now, with the convenience of the internet and other tools, women, especially mothers with young children, find working from home more appealing. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we look at ways mothers can continue to contribute financially to their household without sacrificing much time away from their children. Also, we'll get tips from mothers who have achieved this objective, the jobs and the companies with the flexibilities that mothers long for. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. Our world is in a difficult moment of transition. The future is multipolar, but our multilateral institutions reflect a bygone age. The global financial architecture is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. It requires deep structural reform, and the same can be said about the UN Security Council. We need effective international institutions rooted in the 21st century's realities. Not my words, that is what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres told the G20 summit in India recently. And that summit saw the African Union finally admitted to the G20 club of the world's most powerful economies. So now all eyes are on the United Nations. What about that permanent seat for Africa on the UN Security Council? Is it more or less of a pipe dream now? And with the leaders of 4 of the permanent members of the Council skipping this week's high-level gathering, how committed is the United Nations to serious structural reform? My guests are Franny Lothier. She's the CEO of Southbridge Investments. She joins us via Skype from Helsinki in Finland. And also with us is Michael Walsh. He's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Franny and Michael, a warm welcome to both of you. Great to have you here. And Michael, I'm going to start with you. Could you sum up for us the geopolitical climate in which this UNGA is taking place this week?
I think that when you look at what's been going on since the last UNGA, we've had this sort of question about what does unhinging mean, right? So you heard the Secretary General talking about the world becoming unhinged. So what is unhinged? So you have an unhinging on priorities. So there's a debate over what are the priorities for the world. If you ask a small island state, obviously sea level rise is a key issue for them. It's an existential issue. If you ask the US, it's Ukraine right now is the main issue, right? So when we go across the board, there's different countries have different priorities. But it's the range of priorities and the intensity of debate, I think, which makes it qualify for this unhinged level. But then there's another type of unhinging that's happening in that we've had a proliferation of multilateral organizations. So now there's a debate not only on what should the issues be, but where should you actually debate the issues? Where should the decisions be made? And so we saw the BRICS summit and all of the things that happened there. We see the G7, we see the G20, we see all these institutions. So now there's another question about where should we be having these discussions?
And we'll get through some of that again later on in the discussion. Franny, we see the leaders of France, the UK, China and Russia skipping this week's events. Of course, we know Xi Jinping never comes. There's also, of course, the ICC arrest warrant out for Russian President Vladimir Putin. So he wasn't going to show up anyway. But does the absence of these leaders tell us anything about just how relevant the United Nations is as a sort of forum, the way in which Michael just referred to?
I think the United Nations remains extremely relevant, and that can be proven by just how many African heads of state have showed up for this meeting and the agenda that they bring with them for conversation. This comes after the admission of the African Union into the G20, and of course, a very successful Africa Climate Summit, which for the first time came with a common position on climate issues that Africa has put together, not just for the continent, but for the whole world. And I think this positions then the UN in a very important location vis-a-vis the low-income countries and countries that are facing the severest risks from climate, especially given what's going on around the world right now. So I would say that the importance of the UN cannot be even more emphasized, and that is shown by the number of countries who need the UN who have showed up.
Michael, of course, now we've been referring to this historic moment of the AU being admitted to the G20 or G20 plus now, as I've heard it being called. What does that admission mean for the push for a permanent seat for Africa or the African Union at the UN Security Council?
I mean, it builds political momentum, but at the same time, they're de-linked from each other, right? We're talking about two different conversations. And so the big question for the AU and for the AU member states when we start talking about the Security Council is what's the process, even if you get to the point where there's an acceptance that we're going to move in this direction, how are you going to pick who gets to be seated, right? And this is an agency issue. Who's going to have an agency? Who's going to speak on behalf of Africa? And when you look at what happened yesterday with the comments that were made, I mean, the Nigerian president spoke very sort of broadly about the issues facing. It wasn't the issues facing Nigeria, it's the issues facing Africa. And so that gave a stage, an opportunity for him to demonstrate, his leadership on behalf of the continent. But that's a decision that has to be made, and that's a very difficult decision to be made. So I'm not sure that it necessarily has a direct correlation here, but there is going to be some momentum that they get out of this, and people will try to build on that.
But it's all part of Africa wanting a bigger voice on the international stage. Maybe does that bring us to the possibility that Africa might need more than one seat? Because yes, of course, countries do have different aspirations. Their economies are moving on different trajectories. How would you figure that anyway?
I mean, there's so many different international organizations, multilateral organizations that exist, right? So even if you get a seat on the Security Council, you're not going to have a seat in the Five Eyes discussions or in the BRIC discussion. Some countries will, but you're not going to have a discussion at the G7, right? And so when you start talking about these different organizations, it matters which organizations you're in, because we're having discussions happening across multiple organizations. So just getting a Security Council seat alone doesn't necessarily achieve what it would have achieved in 1960 or 1970, but it's a huge step forward. Mm-hmm. And so it's symbolic, and it actually is pragmatically important because it does give an opportunity to be able to elevate these issues and to have a voice on a stage that Africa hasn't had that voice yet.
Franny, one area, of course, we can be certain the Africans are going to want to see change now that it is part of Africa as a region is part of the G20, and that's reform of the global financial system. Just getting admitted to the G20, that alone, that process has taken the AU about 7 years. Do you see us getting to the point of reforms in the global financial system? Do you see that happening in the short to medium term? And what exactly needs to change first?
I think there's a lot of optimism now around the changes in the multilateral development banks, which have been undertaking a series of reforms with benchmarking taking place across them. That was reviewed recently at the G20 meeting. You have also discussions within the multilateral development banks on more representation of Africa in those banks. And then, of course, you have the outcome of this Nairobi Africa Climate Summit, which, in addition to having a common voice on climate issues, also emphasized the importance of the reform of the multilateral system and the need to listen to Africa's own solutions and focus on investments and trade, in addition to the other relationships that the continent has had with the rest of the world. So I think there is optimism now that because of climate and the risks that Africa is facing, and because of the recent challenges with a number of coups that have taken place on the continent, some other security risks, that these security issues, whether climate-related or related to war and other security challenges, make it imperative for Africa to have a bigger voice in those institutions that make decisions around security. And since security is linked to development finance and to development outcomes, that means also the multilateral development institutions that are responsible for development finance.
Michael, what is your take? I mean, what does this momentum we talk about? What is this spotlight right now on giving Africa a bigger voice on the international stage? What does that do for its quest to see global financial reform?
I mean, when you see what Ramaphosa was saying when he gave his talk about their efforts in Ukraine and trying to provide evidence that this was important, that this was valuable, that this achieved something, right? Being able to have these data points, to be able to say that Africa is advocating for things and it's leading to results, that momentum is powerful because that pushes us towards a recognition that all of this engagement is meaningful, even if it's slow. And it has been slow. So when you hear about the push towards financial reform, that's been slow. But African voices are continuing to advocate for it and continuing to push for it. So whether it's security or finance or whatever we're talking about, across the board, African states and their leaders are speaking and advocating for change. And every time they're able to actually achieve a result from that change, that adds more data points to be able to say we're making progress. And that's what they're trying to do. The question is whether they're making progress quickly enough to meet their own internal desires.
Right, correct. Franny, one thing, of course, about the UNGA bringing everyone together is that it also gives us some insight into the geopolitical divisions and tensions that do exist in the world. Is it worse than we think, or is there more cooperation and unity among nations than, maybe perhaps those of us in the media give the world the impression?
I think this perhaps can be drawn since the COVID crisis, where there was a huge demand for global cooperation in order to get to solutions. And some of the pressures for Africa to be better represented also come from that time where the access to vaccines was quite limited for Africa because it was not present in those conversations and decision making. So I think it started much earlier than the current situation with the war in Ukraine. And I think it really pushes us for more multilateral decision making, and Africa is asking for that because the world has become more complex. The kind of decisions we need to make need to be more collaborative to solve the climate crisis. So if you take the example of the Nairobi Climate Summit, where Africa says, yes, we are not the ones who've been responsible for generating all of these emissions, but we are going to be the ones responsible to actually seek solutions that help the whole world decarbonize. And that's a cooperative decision by Africa to cooperate with the rest of the world. The same thing can be said about security issues because these are interconnected, and the same thing can be said also about development issues because without development you cannot have trade, and without trade we don't have the ability to maintain the quality of life in all countries, whether more advanced economies or developing countries.
Franny talked about some of this earlier, Michael, but I want to get your take. How relevant and useful is the United Nations still as a platform for nations coming together to debate? You mentioned earlier there are so many other options right now, but how useful and how relevant is the United Nations still?
Well, we're here today talking about it, so you know, that's an indication, right? So, you know, for states that aren't parties to the G20, who aren't parties to some of these other institutions, removing the UNGA as a central convening moment every year would take their political agency away from them. They have an opportunity to stand on a stage and tell the world and declare, these are the issues that matter to our people. These are the issues the world should take attention to and should take action on. And so to remove that would actually remove the agency of those countries. So while it's important, we're talking about the Security Council reform, or we're talking about BRICS, or we're talking about all these other organizations that people are advocating in the world, those maybe are meaningful for those countries that are participating, and indirectly it might be meaningful for some of the countries that can get indirectly represented by those states. But this is direct opportunity for these states to engage, and their heads of states to come to New York and to make these statements, and we all pay attention to them. And so I think it is still relevant to this day, and it gives an ability to elevate policy issues which wouldn't get elevated otherwise. And I'll give one example, is, you know, the mineral exploitation issue that was raised yesterday on the floor. You know, that's an issue that we don't talk about a lot, but you do talk about it in context of African conversations. And so, you know, that's an opportunity for someone to come from the continent and to make that statement on the world stage and to elevate that policy priority. So it's meaningful in that sense.
Franny, just very briefly, we saw US President Joe Biden's speech yesterday focus almost entirely on Russia's war in Ukraine. But, you know, of course, in recent years, we've seen pressure on countries to choose sides. Do you sense there is war fatigue creeping in among nations, irrespective of which side they've actually chosen?
I think in general, history has proven that being non-aligned has always been helpful for countries that are dependent on other countries for their own development. And the current situation really puts those countries, like the majority of countries in Africa, in a difficult situation. So I do think that being able to reach out, and I was very happy, for example, to see the outcome of the US-Africa Business Forum, which took place in Botswana, and that followed on a very successful business summit that took place in Washington, hosted by President Biden. So paying attention to the issues that African countries are facing actually helps to push forward on development issues, and that then helps the whole world and not just Africa. And finally, when you look at the youth of Africa, they are very expectant that the future is going to be better than the past. And because they're the majority now, with more than 60% of the population under 25, being able to forge those relationships between the young people of Africa and those in the rest of the world, and particularly in areas which have large African diasporas like the United States, Brazil, and Europe, does give that opportunity for collaboration across continents, because youth share ideas on music and film and literature and other cultural factors that create a closeness that cannot be achieved through other means. And this soft diplomacy, I think, is equally important and is moving along quite well because the young people are driving it. So I think this is really important. And even though we are right now distracted by the war in Ukraine, the issues of development remain central. The challenges of climate are very important and need to be attended to. And countries in Africa are hurting from both those fronts.
True indeed. Franny, when we speak of Africa's youth, it always does make one feel a lot more hopeful. Well, Franny Lothier and Michael Walsh, I do appreciate your perspectives, and I do appreciate your time. Thank you both for joining me. And that is our show this week. Thank you, as always, for watching and for always listening. I will see you next time. Until then, it's goodbye.